My name is Nora Vale, and I was 35 when my father laughed at me across a lawyer's table. We were gathered to hear my grandfather's will. The attorney adjusted his glasses, looked down the page, and announced that I had been left the old house on Alder Lane and a single $20 bill. The room broke open with laughter. My father tipped back in his chair and made sure everyone heard him. All those years running errands for a broke old fool, and this is your prize. A rotten house and pocket money. I didn't defend myself. I only smiled, took the tired bill from the envelope, and left. What none of them noticed was the serial number. My grandfather had taught me, since I was a child, that numbers were never just numbers. 42 hours later, I understood exactly what my family had been hiding. Welcome back to Quiet Ledger Stories, where the overlooked speak softly and let proof make the noise. If you've ever been treated like the least important person in the room, this story is for you. Leave a comment and make sure you subscribe. The office belonged to Leonard Rusk, the attorney who had handled Vale family matters for 28 years. He read legal language in a careful, regretful voice, as though every sentence had personally disappointed him. My Uncle Martin sat near the tall window in a navy suit, his hands folded, calm in the way a man is calm when he thinks he already knows the ending. His wife, Jocelyn, kept glancing at her phone. Their 3 children had taken the comfortable chairs. My father, Daniel, sat at the head of the table as if somebody had engraved his name on it. I took the seat closest to the door. Rusk began with the business. Martin would retain operating authority over Vale Tool and Timber. Daniel would receive the liquid accounts. The grandchildren on Martin's side each received a tidy amount. Then Rusk reached my name, and the air changed. To my granddaughter, Nora, he read, I leave the residence on Alder Lane and $20. For 1 second, everyone simply stared. Jocelyn laughed first, a clipped little sound, and then the others followed. Martin did not laugh. He watched me instead. That would matter later. Rusk pushed a small envelope toward me. Inside lay one old $20 bill, limp from years of handling, with soft corners and a crease through the center. My father wiped at one eye like the whole scene had made his week. $20 and a demolition job, he said. Granddad really knew how to reward loyalty. I held the bill between my fingers and felt how intentionally worn it was. My grandfather kept fresh bills in a kitchen clip for groceries. Old bills were for lessons. He never gave me one accidentally. So while the room enjoyed itself, I asked the only question worth asking. Why would a man who sorted spare nails by length and labeled every jar in his shed leave me this exact bill and nothing else? I slipped the envelope into my coat, thanked Mr. Rusk, and stood. No one seemed to notice that I was not humiliated. Around town, people knew me as the quiet librarian at the Ashford Avenue branch. I checked in returns, ran reading circles, helped older patrons with forms, and usually ate lunch in the back office. I liked quiet systems, clean records, and the moment confusing facts finally lined up. During the last 6 years of Arthur Vale's life, I was also the one who came when he needed something. I drove him to his heart specialist on the first Thursday of every month. I filled his pill organizer on Saturday mornings. I sat with him through long afternoons when everyone else was somehow too busy. I never thought of it as sacrifice. Maybe that was my fault. I carried what needed carrying because setting it down felt like failing. My grandfather understood that part of me better than anyone. When I was 7, he used to hide a nickel or a folded note somewhere in his house and leave a string of numbers on the kitchen pad. Count clean, he would say, tapping the paper with one square finger. The numbers were never nonsense. They meant a shelf, a page, a step count from a doorway, a cabinet from the right, a tile from the far corner. It took me an entire summer to learn his method. After that, his strange little codes felt as plain as a map drawn in blue ink. The family dismissed it as a lonely old man entertaining an awkward child. To me, it was the first conversation I had ever had with an adult who assumed I was smart. So when my father called my inheritance junk, I did not shrink. I felt the old bill in my pocket and thought of a man who had never once given me a number that led nowhere. The laughter in Rusk's office made sense if you understood what my family had decided Arthur was. He opened Vale Tool and Timber in 1973 with a small loan, a rented storefront, and enough stubbornness to survive 3 recessions. For years, contractors bought supplies there, and half the kids in town bought their first fishing knife from the glass case. Then my father and uncle joined the store and decided the founder was outdated. They upgraded registers, added credit accounts, hired a bookkeeper, and built a back office with software my grandfather never trusted. Little by little, they moved him from the accounts to the counter, then to a chair near the door, and finally home. By the time I was finishing college, the family's official version had hardened. Arthur had been kind but careless. He was a decent man, they said, but not a serious businessman. He let the store drift. He never invested wisely. He would leave almost nothing behind. My father repeated that so often it became family scripture. Dad had a good heart, Daniel would say, but he couldn't manage a lemonade cart. I believed it for a while. Why wouldn't I? My grandfather drove a 17-year-old pickup and saved coupons in a rubber-banded stack. Still, one thing never fit. Arthur was the most precise person I had ever known. He balanced a checkbook down to the cent. He filed receipts by month and year in shoeboxes that went back to the Ford administration. A man like that does not misplace money because he forgot to pay attention. Once, near the end, he squeezed my hand on the back porch and said something I saved without understanding. The store was never the heart of it, Nora. At the time, I thought illness had made him sentimental. Now I had his decaying house, an old bill with a number on it, and a feeling that the real heart of it had been buried somewhere very deliberately. The store had always been their crown. I was beginning to suspect it had also been their cover. I drove to the Alder Lane house 3 days after the funeral. It stood at the far edge of town, 18 minutes from my apartment, where the pavement narrowed and turned pale with dust. From the road, my father's insult looked accurate. The porch dipped on the left. The gutters hung tired and uneven. One shutter clung crookedly to a front window like it had given up halfway through falling. Anyone passing by would have seen a teardown and kept going. I unlocked the door with the key Rusk had given me, and the smell reached me before anything else did. Cedar, paper, and machine oil. It was the smell of my grandfather's hands. For a breath, I was a child again, watching him sharpen a plain blade in the shed while sunlight crossed the workbench in strips. Then I looked around, and the contradiction became impossible to ignore. The outside was neglected. The inside was exact. Books were alphabetized. Kitchen drawers carried labels in his block printing. Shirts were sorted by color, season, and wear. This was not the home of a man who had stopped caring. It was the home of a man who cared and wanted others to think he didn't. I moved through the rooms the way I moved through the library at closing, checking each section, noticing what belonged where. Nothing lay under dust. Nothing looked accidental. By the rear door hung a store calendar from 3 years earlier. Every medical appointment had been written in his hand, including the ones I had driven him to. He had made a record of my showing up. I stood there longer than I expected. A rotten house, my father had called it. But people do not label every drawer in a house they consider worthless. They label things because they expect someone to search. That evening, I sat at my grandfather's kitchen table and took out the 20. I pressed it flat under the yellow lamp and looked properly at the serial number for the first time. The letters and digits ran across the lower corner. As soon as I read them, an old part of my mind woke up. The pattern felt wrong for an ordinary bill. Arthur's number games had rules. A pair of letters named a category. Numbers pointed to a place. Sometimes a split meant a drawer and a count. Sometimes it meant a row and an object inside it. I read the serial number again, slower. The first letters matched the code we used for the workshop. The digits divided into two uneven groups exactly the way his hiding games used to divide. My hands went cold, but not from fear. Recognition can feel almost like fear if it arrives suddenly enough. He had not left me $20. He had left me instructions. I found a pencil in the junk drawer, wrote the number on the back of a library receipt, and broke it apart the way he had taught me. Letters first, then the longer string, then the smaller one. The answer pointed toward the workshop behind the house, and inside the workshop to a place counted from a corner. I did not go out there in the dark. I sat with the bill instead, turning it over and over while his voice came back to me as clearly as if he were sitting across from me. Count clean. For most of my life, I thought that meant be patient. Now I understood it had always also meant exactly what it said. It was an instruction waiting more than 20 years for the only person who had bothered to learn his language. The office came back to me then. My father's grin, Jocelyn's little laugh, Martin's silent stare. They thought the joke was that I had received nothing. The real joke was that I might have been the only person Arthur trusted with everything. My father called the next morning before I had finished my toast. He did not bother with hello. "I've been thinking about that house," he said, using the friendly voice that had never meant anything good. "It's a burden, old wiring, rot, probably mold. Keep it and you'll be paying taxes on a liability for years." "I haven't made a decision," I said. "Don't make a project out of it. I know someone who buys places like that, cash, fast closing. You sign, he handles the headaches, and you walk away with something useful." There it was, urgency. My father had never hurried to help me with anything. Now he wanted my signature before the estate paperwork had even cooled. I am not dramatic, but I am observant. Observant people notice when someone suddenly wants speed. So I did what I always do when the numbers do not match the story. I asked one plain question. "Why is this buyer so eager for a house you say is falling apart?" The pause was small, but I heard it. "He flips properties," Daniel said. "Don't turn everything into a mystery, Nora." I told him I would consider it and ended the call. Then I did 3 things. I photographed every room in the house. I phoned Rusk's office and confirmed that nothing could be sold for several weeks while the probate process moved. Then I wrote the date, time, and contents of my father's call in the notebook I keep for everything. That was not paranoia. That was librarianship. When someone who has never protected you starts pushing you to give up the only thing he laughed at, you do not sign. You begin a record. Jocelyn texted less than an hour later, all soft concern and bright little emojis, asking whether I wanted help clearing out Grandpa's mess. I did not answer. I was starting to think the mess might be the entire point. The workshop stood behind the house, low and narrow, smelling even more strongly of cedar and oil. Arthur had built it himself before I was born. Inside, one wall was covered with small wooden drawers, each marked in his tidy block hand. It looked like an old card catalog crossed with a machinist's dream. I stood before that wall and read my notes again. The letters from the bill named this section. The longer number gave me a drawer. The shorter number gave me a position inside it. I counted clean, the way he had drilled into me, and pulled the drawer open. Beneath a tray of brass hinges was a notebook with a cracked blue-green spine. It was not a sales log. The cover had gone soft at the lower corner where a thumb had rested over and over. When I lifted it out, a folded note slid from the pages. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Cheap things carry the truth. Count clean." I read the line twice, then sat on his work stool with the ledger in my lap. The first pages looked ordinary enough: dates, amounts, short marks, initials. But the longer I studied them, the less ordinary they became. These entries did not track money coming into the store. They followed money going out of accounts that were not mentioned in the official books. Each line had a date, a precise amount, and two initials. Some were MV, some were DV, my uncle, my father. I did not understand the whole shape yet, but I understood enough to feel the floor tilt. Arthur had not hidden a store inventory book inside a coded drawer. He had hidden something else. He had built a trail over decades so that one day the granddaughter who counted carefully would come to this exact wall, open this exact drawer, and find what everyone else had dismissed as clutter. This was not junk. This was a record. I took the ledger back to my apartment and spread it across my kitchen table under the brightest lamp I owned, the way I lay out damaged books before repair. My job has trained me to read documents that resist being read. Blurred due date slips, water-stained donations, handwritten notes in margins, local records filed by people who thought alphabetizing was a suggestion. A handmade ledger did not frighten me. I began by separating facts from guesses. The columns stayed consistent: date, amount, code, initials. The dates covered 8 years, ending roughly 14 months before Arthur became too weak to write steadily. The amounts were almost never round. That bothered me first. Real expenses often come in clean numbers: flat fees, monthly retainers, even payments. These figures were jagged and specific, the kind you see when someone is shaving a percentage from a larger amount and trying not to leave neat footprints. I pulled out my own notes from the years when I had helped Arthur read bank statements and set them beside the ledger. The official family story, the one repeated at holidays, described a sound business run by Daniel and Martin, while the old founder faded harmlessly into the background. Arthur's private ledger told a different story. Money was leaving accounts the official books did not mention. Two versions of the same company existed on paper, and only one fit reality. I leaned back and stared at the blue-green book. My grandfather, the bad businessman, had quietly kept a parallel account of his own company for almost a decade. He had not been poor with numbers. He had been better with them than anyone in that room. He had simply stopped explaining himself once he realized the people taking the money were the people who sat at his table on holidays. The question that kept me awake was not whether something had happened. The question was how long he had known, and why he had waited until after his death to let it surface. For the next several days, I treated the ledger like a research project. My family would never have believed that, which is why Arthur chose me. They saw a woman who stamped books. I saw a question with a findable answer. I compared the dates with every public record I could legally access: county filings, lien notices, supplier registrations, and the store's vendor list. Where the official accounts showed a supplier payment, Arthur's ledger sometimes showed a smaller withdrawal days later, marked with initials. The pattern was ugly because it was patient. Nearly every legitimate transaction seemed to carry a little shadow beside it. A piece was peeled away and directed somewhere else. One entry by itself could be explained: petty cash mistake, duplicate note, late correction. But the pattern held across 8 years and multiple hands that were not my grandfather's. Patterns do not lie with the ease people do. I started building a timeline on index cards, one suspicious entry per card, and pinned them to my living room wall. By Thursday night, the wall had filled. By Friday morning, the shape was unmistakable. This was not a foolish old man losing control of his store. This was a deliberate drain hidden inside a business everyone praised. And the man who noticed it first, who had documented it in code, had handed it to the one person nobody would think dangerous. I looked at the cards and felt something colder than anger. Not triumph. Not grief either. It was the feeling of finally finding the missing volume and knowing exactly who had taken it from the shelf. Martin came to the Alder Lane house that Sunday without calling first. I heard his car tires on the gravel and met him on the porch before he could step inside. He smiled the same way he had at the will reading, mild and faintly pitying. "Just wanted to see how you were managing," he said. "Cleaning out a place like this is a heavy job. You shouldn't have to do it alone." His eyes were not on my face. They slipped past my shoulder into the hallway over the sitting room toward the rear door that led out to the workshop. "I have it handled," I said. He nodded, slow and sympathetic. "Your father is right about the buyer. Houses like this swallow time. People get sentimental about old things that don't matter." He let the words settle. "I'd hate for you to spend your whole month digging through an old man's clutter and ending up hurt." I kept my expression the way I keep it when someone at the circulation desk insists a book returned itself. Pleasant, blank, patient. "I appreciate the concern." He looked at me a moment too long. Then he touched the porch rail as if he were saying goodbye to the house rather than to me. "Call if you change your mind." I watched his car until the dust settled. Standing on that sagging porch, I understood that my uncle had not driven 18 minutes on a Sunday because he cared whether I was overwhelmed. He had come to find out what I had already found. The word junk was working very hard in my family now, always from the same two men, always aimed at the same property. People do not keep insisting something is worthless unless they are frightened of its value. People ask why I did not just sell the house and take the money. The answer is simple. My grandfather did not hide his truth in a place where a lazy person would stumble over it. He hid it where only someone willing to count would reach it. If you have ever been the person who showed up while everyone else had excuses, subscribe. This one belongs to you. After Martin left, I returned to the wall of drawers because now I knew there had to be more. On the first page of the ledger, along the margin, Arthur had written a faint string of letters and numbers in pencil. I had missed it at first because he had pressed so lightly. It pointed to another drawer low on the left side, near the floor. I counted clean and opened it. Under a tray of drill bits sat a flat metal tin. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was an identification card I had never seen before. The photograph showed a much younger Arthur with dark hair and an unsmiling face. The agency printed on the card was the Federal Office of Revenue Inspection. Beneath it were commendation letters in dry government language, the kind that says much by saying little. For most of my life, I was told that before the store, my grandfather traveled as a purchasing auditor. That was not true. He had done quiet government work that taught him to document every claim and trust only evidence that survived a challenge. I sat on the workshop floor with the tin in my lap while my idea of him rearranged itself. The labeled drawers, the exact checkbook, the coded games, the ledger written in parallel beside the official one. None of it was the harmless oddness of a lonely old man. It was training. Arthur had built his life around one rule: truth lasts only when someone writes it down where it cannot be erased. When he realized his own sons were draining the business he had built, he did not shout across a dinner table. He did what he knew how to do. He opened a clean page, picked up a pencil, and began the record. One name appeared several times in the ledger margins near the final pages: E. Marsh. A small star sat beside it every time. I knew the name. Edwin Marsh had managed the old savings bank on Market Street before a regional chain bought it. He and Arthur had been friends longer than I had been alive. Edwin was in his early 80s now and lived above the former bank building, in an apartment crowded with boxes and framed certificates. I brought him black coffee and sat across from him in his dim living room. When I mentioned the blue-green ledger, his face changed. He set his cup down with care. "I wondered whether you would come," he said. Arthur said one of you might. He was certain it would be the one who asked the right question, not the one who wanted the money fastest. What was the right question? Edwin gave me a tired smile. You asked it by carrying that ledger here. Then he told me slowly what Arthur had done. My grandfather had known for years that Daniel and Martin were taking money. He came to Edwin not because he wanted an immediate fight, but because he wanted the evidence preserved so clearly that no one could dismiss it later as the confusion of a sick old man. He chose the bill himself, Edwin said. Went through a strap of 20s until he found a serial number that matched those counting lessons he taught you. He left written instructions with the lawyer. The bill was to be placed in your hand, not mailed, not given through anyone else. Why not confront them? I asked. He used one word whenever I asked that: record. He said the loud ones win arguments at dinner tables, but the careful ones win when the file is opened. Edwin looked at me over his glasses. He left something for you at the bank. I cannot simply hand it to you, but if you bring the right number and the proper paperwork, I can take you to it. The bill in my pocket seemed heavier. Count clean, I said. Edwin nodded. He said you would say exactly that. Before the bank, there was one more drawer. Edwin's words sent me back to the workshop with sharper eyes. I found what I had missed behind the drawer that held the ledger, a false backing I had overlooked because I had stopped counting one step too early. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name printed in Arthur's block letters. Beneath it sat a narrow stack of bank statements clipped together with a rusted paper clip. I opened the statements first because my hands needed a task. They were from Arthur's personal accounts, the ones I had helped him read when his eyesight failed. There, in black ink, were withdrawals I had never authorized and he had never mentioned. Transfers out. Checks signed with a version of his signature that looked close at first, then wrong the longer you stared. The dates belonged to months when he could barely grip a spoon. My father and uncle had not only skimmed from the business. Near the end, while Arthur was weakest, they had reached into his personal accounts and taken from him directly. They had forged the hand of a man too ill to stop them. I set the papers down and breathed until the room steadied. Then I opened the letter. It was brief, because Arthur always believed extra words were where people hid. He wrote that he was sorry to leave me a fight instead of a gift. He wrote that he had watched me come every Saturday and every appointment day, and that I was the only person in the family who seemed to understand that love was mostly attention paid over time. He wrote that the $20 bill was not money but a map to a box at Edwin's old bank. The number would tell me which one. Everything I needed to finish his work would be inside. At the bottom, underlined once, he had written, "Cheap things carry the truth. Count clean, you always did." I sat in the workshop, surrounded by cedar and oil and the quiet wall of numbered drawers. I stopped being a granddaughter sorting through somebody else's leftovers. I became the keeper of the record. That night, I read the letter twice more, then a third time until I heard his voice instead of seeing the ink. People assume a discovery like that fills you with rage. I waited for rage because rage would have been simple. It did not arrive the way I expected. What came instead was a hard, steady clarity. Arthur had folded his final lesson into one instruction. He could have burned the family down while he was alive. He could have called a lawyer, made accusations, and let the town watch his sons scramble while he still had breath enough to enjoy it. He chose not to. Now I understood why. A scene fades. A shouting match becomes one person's claim against another's. Arthur had lived long enough to know that loud accusations disappear into louder denial. Documents remain. So he chose the slow thing, the quiet thing, the thing that cannot be laughed out of a room. He chose to be right on paper. And he chose me to carry it, not because I needed money or because anyone owed me a reward, but because I was the child who had learned to count clean when counting was still a game between an old man and a lonely girl. I looked at the index cards, the ledger, the forged statements, and the letter. I thought of my father's grin in Rusk's office, Jocelyn's laugh, Martin's measuring stare. I was not going to scream. I was not going to bait them into a recording or match their volume. I was going to do exactly what Arthur taught me. I would gather every page, put it into the hands of professionals whose job was proof, and let the record speak somewhere laughter would not help them. This was not revenge. It was accounting. Edwin met me at the bank on a Tuesday morning after helping arrange the appointment. It was never as easy as walking in with a serial number. Arthur had registered the box years earlier and named me in writing as the person entitled to access it after his death. The estate papers from the will reading and my identification were what persuaded the bank to open the vault. The serial number was not the key. It was the map. Once the manager verified me, the bill told me where to look. The letters pointed to the row. The longer number matched the drawer. The shorter one matched a note Arthur had left in the file. Everything aligned. The drawer slid out, long and heavy. Inside was the rest of it, and the rest of it was nearly everything. Years of bank statements divided by account. A second set of store books, the real set, organized beside copies of the official books so the differences could be seen without explanation. Photocopies of checks with false signatures laid next to authentic signatures for comparison. A typed index in Arthur's plain language explained what each document showed and how it connected to the next. He had not left me clues. He had left me a finished case, assembled by a man who understood that evidence must be built to withstand people who lie professionally, and people who lie because the truth would ruin them. I stood with one hand on the stack, feeling the last piece lock into place. The serial number on a $20 bill, the little joke at the will reading, had led exactly where he planned, to a bank drawer holding proof of everything they had taken. Edwin watched me quietly. He always said you would know what to do. I did know. I need a forensic accountant, I said. Then I need the prosecutor's office. Edwin's mouth twitched. He said you would say something like that, too. My father learned that I had been to the bank the way he learned most things, through Jocelyn and a chain of relatives who treated gossip like civic duty. He came at me with the only weapon he trusted, public performance. He appeared at the library on a Wednesday afternoon during story time, when the carpet was full of toddlers and parents were hovering near the picture books. He did not shout at first. He leaned against my desk and spoke just loudly enough to carry. He said he was worried about me. He said grief could twist people. He said I had been pressuring the family and manipulating a dying man for months. A mother near the early reader shelf looked up. "It's sad," my father said, shaking his head for the room. "She talked him into changing things when he wasn't in his right mind. We're trying to handle this gently." It was an efficient piece of cruelty. In one move, he became the patient father and I became the schemer. By supper, the story would be moving through town. Quiet Nora, revealed as greedy, the good granddaughter, exposed as someone who preyed on a confused old man. I kept my voice even. "You should leave, Dad. There are children here." He smiled as though he had won, straightened his jacket, and walked out, leaving me in front of coworkers and patrons with heat crawling up my neck. For one ugly minute, I wanted to chase him into the parking lot and shout the truth until everyone heard it. I did not. I went into the staff room, closed the door, and wrote down the date, time, exact words I could remember, and the names of 4 witnesses. He had chosen public shame. I had already chosen paper. That night, I copied everything. Then I copied the copies. One set went into a fireproof pouch. One went into a deposit box under my own name. One went into a locked cabinet at the library. Old lessons from a grandfather who taught me that truth survives better when it exists in more than one place. I did not buy a recorder. I did not try to trick Daniel or Martin into admitting something over the phone. I had seen enough people lose by playing the other side's game. My family's weapons were noise, confidence, speed, and a lie repeated until listeners got tired and accepted it as history. If I answered noise with noise, the question would become whose voice carried farther. Theirs always had. So I refused that fight and chose the one they could not win. I would not be louder. I would be documented. The next morning, I called a forensic accountant in a town 30 miles east, whose name I found through a referral list from the County Legal Association. I wanted someone with no friendship, history, or business connection to anyone named Vale. Her name was Tessa Calder, and she had spent 17 years rebuilding financial crime trails from partial records. I told her I had 8 years of parallel ledgers, forged signatures, bank statements, and an index compiled by the victim before he died. There was a pause on the line, not an empty pause, a professional pause, the kind that happens when an ordinary call has suddenly become serious. "Bring all of it," she said. "Originals and copies. Do not rearrange the order. I want to see it exactly as he left it." I hung up and saw the path ahead. Slow, dull, precise. Exactly what Arthur would have chosen. Tessa Calder laid my grandfather's record across a conference table and went quiet for a long time. I watched her read almost the way I read. Finger moving down a column, eyes comparing 2 pages, a notebook filling with tight marks. After nearly 90 minutes, she looked up. "Your grandfather," she said carefully, "completed about 3/4 of my reconstruction before he died." She walked me through the documents. The official books for Vale Tool and Timber showed healthy revenue and ordinary expenses. The bank records told the quieter story. Vendor payments had been inflated. Portions then moved out again, toward accounts that did not belong to the business. Across 8 years, the diverted money reached a number high enough to make my stomach drop deep into 6 figures. Then came the withdrawals from Arthur's personal accounts during his final 18 months, signed with a hand that did not match older examples. "This portion is separate," Tessa said, tapping the copies of the checks. "Taking money out of a business you control is bad enough. Removing funds directly from an elderly man's personal accounts with a forged signature while he is medically compromised is something else." She chose her words carefully, the way honest experts do. She did not promise that anyone would be convicted. She said the documentation was strong. She said the loss was clearly quantified. She said that under Indiana law, the pattern could support civil recovery for the estate and a referral for criminal review, especially regarding financial exploitation and forgery. "Could," she repeated, making sure I understood. "I am not a prosecutor, but I have testified in more cases like this than I wish existed, and most do not arrive this orderly." She tapped Arthur's index. "He did not leave you a mess, Ms. Vale. He left you a file. What happens now?" "Now," Tessa said, keeping her pen in her hand, "we make it official." The attorney Tessa recommended was an estate lawyer named Miriam Sloan. Her first act was to slow me down. I arrived ready to bury my family under every page Arthur had saved. Miriam made me sit with the rules. Not every item could be used in the same way, she explained. Some older skimming might face time-limit arguments. A good defense attorney would attack anything near the edge of the legal window. But the pattern continued over years, and the most serious conduct, the forged withdrawals from Arthur's personal accounts, was recent, specific, and severe. "The estate has standing," she said. "As a beneficiary and the inheritor of the Alder Lane property, you can pursue civil recovery." And a forensic report this organized, combined with signature evidence, is the kind of referral a county prosecutor will at least have to take seriously. Like Tessa, she promised nothing she could not control. She talked about referrals, review, restitution, civil claims, evidentiary standards, and the difference between what documents show and what a court eventually decides. After weeks of my family's confident lies, it felt almost comforting to sit with someone careful enough not to oversell the truth. I asked the only question that mattered to me. Is it enough to make sure this cannot simply disappear? Miriam looked at the stack of Arthur's work between us. Your grandfather spent 8 years making sure it would not disappear, she said. We are just carrying it the final distance. I signed the engagement agreement, and the slow machinery began moving. My father, for all his volume, would not be able to shout that machinery down. People think revenge sounds like shouting. Usually it sounds like a copier, a forensic report, and a calendar full of legal deadlines. If you want to know how the room that laughed at me went quiet, stay with me and subscribe. The quiet ones are not finished. Jocelyn found me a few days later in the parking lot of Bellwether Market. She must have been waiting because she stepped out between two parked cars too quickly for coincidence. The polished version of her was gone. No cheerful voice. No hearts in a text. Her hands trembled. Nora, please, she said. Whatever you found, please. I stood beside my cart and let her speak because something in her face told me this might be the only honest thing she had said to me in years. It came out in pieces. She knew about the money, not the full details, not the worst of it, but enough. Martin had brought papers home for her to sign over the years and told her they were routine. She had signed because reading them would have meant knowing, and knowing would have required a choice. They were drowning, she said. The life everyone envied, the cars, the vacations, the clothes, the dinners, was held together with debt and other people's money. She had pretended for so long that she could no longer remember the first lie. I have children, she whispered. If this comes out, what happens to them? For a moment, I felt the pull she intended. She was frightened, human, and standing under parking lot lights asking me to make her terror go away. I did not doubt that her fear was real, but I thought about Arthur's forged signature made by someone in that family while he lay weak in the bed whose sheets I had changed. I am sorry you were pulled into this, I said, and I meant it. I really am, but I will not bury it. He didn't bury it, and he had more reason than anyone. She began to cry. I walked her gently back toward her car, left my groceries in the cart for a minute, and drove home with both hands steady on the wheel. Sympathy is not surrender. When public shame did not break me, my father changed methods. He came to my apartment alone, and for the first time in my adult life, he tried to sound like a father. He sat at my kitchen table across from the wall of index cards, which I had not taken down, and he pretended not to see them. Your mother would be heartbroken, he said. God rest her, watching you tear apart your own family because an old man held grudges. I let him talk. He invoked everything, my dead mother, holiday dinners we had not shared in years. Family loyalty, spoken as if it were a bill I had failed to pay. Arthur had been bitter at the end, he said. Arthur had poisoned me against them. I thought papers meant something, but all I had was the resentment of a sick man. Then he reached for the line that had started all of this, only now he softened it until it almost sounded tender. He left you junk, sweetheart. Don't let that ruin the rest of your life. There it was again, the same insult turned inside out. In Rusk's office, it had been thrown for laughs. Now it was a plea because the junk had become the most dangerous thing in his world. I looked at my father at the fear under the performance and felt nearly calm. You keep saying it is junk, I said. You drove across town to persuade me to walk away from it. People do not plead over junk. His jaw tightened. He stood, shoved the chair back too hard, and left without another word. I sat alone with my grandfather's record and understood that the begging meant I had already won the only argument that mattered. A week later, the invitation arrived dressed up as a family meeting. My father called in a formal, stiff voice and said everyone wanted to sit down like adults and resolve the estate. There would be a lawyer present. His lawyer. He wanted me at Rusk's office, same table, to work out a reasonable arrangement for the Alder Lane house. I knew exactly what the meeting was. It was the will reading staged a second time with the same audience. This time, they meant to push me into signing the property away before the legal process finished turning. They wanted the house sold, the workshop emptied, the drawers hauled off, and the record erased. Then they would call it me being sensible at last. I said yes. Miriam lifted one eyebrow when I told her, "You are not required to go. We can handle communication through filings." I know. But I thought of Arthur, who could have done everything privately through lawyers too, yet had arranged for the proof to return to the very room where the laughter happened. Justice can happen on paper between professionals. A reckoning needs witnesses. The people who laughed should be there when the laughing stops, I said. Same table. Miriam studied me, then nodded slowly, the way Edwin had, the way Tessa had. All right, then we go prepared. You speak very little. Let the documents do the work. I almost smiled. That is the one thing my grandfather taught me best. The night before the meeting, I laid everything out one final time and built it into a single ordered packet, much the way Arthur had built the file in the bank box. Tessa's forensic summary went on top. Then the paired ledgers, the official version beside Arthur's. Then the forged checks with genuine signatures beside them. Then the personal bank statements. Last, in its own clear sleeve, I placed Arthur's letter. Some things belong at the end. Miriam confirmed by email that the prosecutor's office had received the referral packet and logged it. That was not a promise of charges. It was a fact on paper that no one could unmake by denying it. Edwin called to say he would attend in a suit and confirm what he knew about how Arthur had created the record and why. I sat for a while with the old $20 bill on the table, the smell of cedar and oil still clinging to my coat, the blue-green ledger under my hand. 3 things they had thought were worthless: a worn-out house, a small bill, and an old man they had rewritten as useless. I was no longer angry. Anger is hot, and heat burns itself out. I needed to be steady. I was something better than angry. I was ready. I thought about every Saturday I had come, every pillbox, every doctor's office, every quiet porch conversation. I understood then that I had not wasted my time on a broke old man. I had earned the only inheritance he truly meant to give me, his trust and his lesson. The careful ones win when the file opens. The next morning, I walked back into the room that had laughed at me, and I did not raise my voice once. It was the same conference room, same long table, same window where Martin preferred to sit, same chair at the head already claimed by my father as though habit were title. Jocelyn sat pale and still, refusing to meet my eyes. The cousins were there too, curious and alert, expecting drama. My father's lawyer was a brisk man with a thin folder. Rusk sat to one side, uneasy, looking like he wished his own office had a back exit. I entered with Miriam and Edwin. I took the same chair by the door. My father smiled when he saw where I sat. He mistook repetition for weakness. He let his lawyer begin. The man slid one sheet across the table, a quitclaim deed already prepared. The Alder Lane property would transfer to a holding company. A modest check had been clipped to the corner. "We think this is more than fair," my father said warmly, performing for the room. "Nora is not equipped to deal with an old property. We take on the burden. She gets a clean start. Everybody gets to move past Dad's mess and act like family again." The room waited for me to argue or fold. I did neither. I did not touch the deed. I opened my bag, took out the packet, and laid it on the table without hurry, aligning the corners as if I were straightening a returned book. My father's smile remained, but his eyes dropped to the stack. I watched the first trace of doubt cross his face. Martin became very still. Miriam folded her hands. I looked at my father, then at the deed between us. "Before I sign anything," I said in the calmest voice I had, Everyone should see what was actually in the junk. I opened the packet and began placing documents one at a time, narrating in the same level tone I used when explaining the copier to confused patrons. "This is the store's official ledger," I said, sliding a copy to the center. "And this is the ledger my grandfather kept at the same time in his own hand for 8 years. I set them side by side. They do not match. Money left the company through inflated supplier payments. Part of it then moved to accounts that were not company accounts. The initials in the margins are MV and DV. I did not look at Martin or Daniel when I said the initials. The paper could look for me. Then I laid down Tessa's report. A licensed forensic accountant reviewed the records. She calculated the loss. It is substantial and it is documented." Jocelyn made a small sound. My father began to speak, but I continued the way you continue reading aloud over a rude interruption. "These," I said, placing the forged checks beside Arthur's real signatures, "are withdrawals from my grandfather's personal accounts during the last 18 months of his life. They were signed with his name by a hand that was not his. He could barely hold a pen by then. I know. I was changing his sheets and driving him to the doctor." The room went silent in a way silence rarely does. Heavy, physical. My father's lawyer was reading the report upside down, and the color had drained from his face. Martin had not moved, but his skin looked gray around the mouth. I placed the final item on the table, Arthur's letter, still in its sleeve. I rested 2 fingers on it and looked at the man who had laughed when I received it all. "It wasn't junk," I said. "It was the receipt for everything you took." Nobody laughed. Not one sound. Then my father exploded exactly as I had expected. He shoved back so hard his chair nearly fell. "This is garbage," he shouted. "The garbage of a senile old man, and she's twisted the whole thing into a story." He pointed at me, red-faced, voice cracking against the walls. His lawyer grabbed his arm and said his name in a low, sharp tone, the way lawyers say a name when a client is in danger of making things worse. Martin, who had always preferred quiet control, finally spoke. His voice was soft and somehow worse than Daniel's shouting. "Where did you get the bank records?" "Not you're wrong. Not that never happened." "Where?" The question of a man calculating how much had already been lost. Miriam answered before I could. "They were lawfully inherited. A referral package has already been received and logged by the county prosecutor's office. I strongly suggest everyone consult separate counsel before making further statements." The word prosecutor landed like a dropped weight. The cousins stared at their fathers. The performance had become something they could not unsee. Jocelyn cried without sound. My loud, confident father, the man who had called me a manipulator in front of toddlers, lowered himself back into his chair. The red left his face, replaced by something I had never seen there. Fear. Plain, animal fear. He looked at the worn $20 bill, which I had placed on top of the letter, and he started to come apart in front of the audience he had chosen. The room that had once burst into laughter now held its breath. I gathered the documents back into order, slid the original packet to Miriam, and left the quitclaim deed untouched in the center of the table. "I will not be signing," I said. "The house is not for sale, and the workshop stays where it is." No one tried to stop me. The cousins would not meet my eyes. Daniel's lawyer had already started muttering about independent representation and saying very little else aloud. Martin watched me with the flat stare of a man doing math he would lose. I picked up the 20 last and put it back into my coat pocket, where it had belonged for weeks. Then I walked toward the same door I had used after the will reading. The first time I had left while they laughed, smiling so they would not see anything. This time I left in silence, and the smile that came was mine alone. At the will reading, they thought they were watching me lose. What they were really watching was Arthur winning slowly from a chair none of them could see, through the one grandchild who had learned to count. I stepped into the hall. Behind me, my father's voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it, asking his lawyer the same question over and over. What do we do? What do we do now? I had no answer for him. Arthur had spent 8 years making sure that by the time Daniel asked, it would already be too late. The reckoning arrived the way Arthur had designed it to arrive. Slowly, on paper, and impossible to shout down. The county prosecutor's office opened a review. It was not quick. Cases like that rarely are. But Arthur had handed them an almost complete investigation, sparing them the years of reconstruction that bury so many elder fraud complaints before they ever reach a courtroom. Nearly 10 months passed through filings, interviews, and expert review before Martin was charged under Indiana law for financial exploitation and the forged withdrawals. The older skimming was more complicated. Some entries were vulnerable because of time limits, but the recent conduct was clean, serious, and enough. My father faced charges of his own, along with a civil action from the estate seeking restitution. A court would spend a long while deciding the final amount owed. Vale Tool and Timber went into receivership and was eventually sold, with the proceeds directed toward repayment. Jocelyn cooperated early, which I was told helped her. For her children's sake, I hoped it did. I did not celebrate. There is no champagne in watching your family name become a diner warning story. But I did not look away. I kept the Alder Lane house. I repaired the porch and gutters myself, badly at first and better after I learned. I cleaned the workshop and left the numbered drawers exactly as Arthur built them. The estate's recovered money went toward something his letter had hoped for without quite asking. I started a fund at the library in his name, the Arthur Vale Fund. It pays for reading support and basic financial literacy classes for anyone in town who has ever been told they are not smart enough to understand their own money. The first class filled in 6 days. I taught it myself on Saturday afternoons. During the hours, I used to spend driving an old man to appointments. It felt like keeping a promise I had made before I knew its shape. My grandfather spent his life proving that the cheapest-looking thing in a room can be the thing holding the whole room together. He also taught me that integrity is the only ledger that balances, no matter how loudly someone insists the figures say otherwise.